everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Michaela Zerkes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Brooklyn for Peace. We'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge that the land that each of us is on, wherever we are, does not belong to us. Here in Brooklyn, we are on the seized and occupied territory of the Lenape people, who took care of this land for generations before they were removed by genocidal violence. Wherever we are, I invite us to pay our respects to those who came before us, their elders past and present, and consider the legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that enable us to be here today. Also, let's take a brief moment of silence to honor the many lives lost in the past few years to COVID-19, police violence, poverty, racism, the climate crisis, and many other devastating events. Thank you. Brooklyn for Peace has been working in Brooklyn since 1984. Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustices which lead to war. We seek to understand and counteract the impact of militarism on our society. And we are primarily an educational organization, but we see active response to injustice as a vital component of our activities. We are a democratically functioning group, nonpartisan, and open to diverse perspectives. And we hope to contribute to the building of a strong progressive social movement. If you're not already a member of Brooklyn for Peace, please go to our website, brooklynpeace.org, and join us. A basic membership is $35 annually, or whatever you can afford, and all donations are tax deductible. And a donation of any size will be greatly appreciated as it enables us to continue doing programs like this one. And the link for making donations will be put in the chat shortly. I'd like to ask that folks keep their microphones on mute during the program, and please type any questions and comments you have into the chat. And we'll take those questions after our speaker has finished their initial remarks. This event is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as on our public access TV program, War No More. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations for joining us and helping to publicize tonight's event: Peace Action Bay Ridge, Peace Action New York State, New York City War Resisters League, and World Can't Wait. So thanks again for joining us. And now I will hand it off to one of our co-vice chairs, Rusty Eisenberg, to introduce our speaker and get us into the program.
Thank you, Michaela. First of all, I want to know, is my microphone working? Yes? Okay. So it's a pleasure to welcome Bill Hartung to our Zoom forum this evening. Many of you are already familiar with Bill's work. He is presently a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And before that, he was the director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy and the co-director of the Center's Sustainable Defense Task Force. Bill is the author of Profits of War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, which is still being made, and the co-editor with Miriam Pemberton of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War. His articles on security issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Nation, and World Policy Journal, and he's been a featured expert on national security on a variety of television programs, television news. So that was the formal list of his qualifications. We've invited Bill to talk with us this evening because he has been an amazing resource for the peace movement. His articles and talks over many years have provided essential information and analysis that groups need to be more effective in promoting a peace agenda. He's also been very generous with his time for our organization and many other peace organizations. And especially now, we're at a particularly dangerous time because of the interlock between the deteriorating relations with Russia and China and the surging military budget. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us. And as Bill speaks, if folks have questions, I want to encourage you to put them in the chat. So Bill, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Rusty. Thanks, Michaela. Thanks, Brooklyn for Peace and all the co-sponsors. And thanks for spending part of your evening to talk about serious matters. I'm going to need your help because we're going to talk about what to do. And of course, I have some knowledge of how the system works, but I think organizing how to reach people, the best agendas are kind of a collective undertaking. So I'll, share some ideas, but I'm looking forward to the conversation we'll have afterwards. So yes, I think we are in a new Cold War, at least, hopefully not worse. And in terms of the Pentagon budget, things are going in the wrong direction. The House of Representatives, which is Democratic controlled, has decided to add $37 billion to what the Pentagon asked for the budget for next year, which will push it to $850 billion, counting the Pentagon and nuclear warhead work at the Department of Energy. Now, it's hard to really fathom how huge a sum that is, but in historical terms, it's more than the peaks of the Vietnam or Korean wars, more than $100 billion, more than the peak of the Cold War. And compared to almost any other thing we need, it's an immense sum. It's about half the discretionary budget of the U.S. government, so more than housing, environmental protection, job training, almost any function of government you can think of. The Pentagon by itself gets more money than all those other agencies and efforts. To get a sense of what that means, first of all, I should say, of course, as was, I think, implied in the introduction, there's so many other things we need to pay attention to, preventing pandemics, dealing with climate change, fighting racial and economic injustice, dealing with people who are trying to dismantle what's left of our democracy. And yet the only thing that Congress can agree on is to throw more money at the Pentagon, which is simply shameful. But to give a sense of how much money this is, I just have a few comparisons. The Pentagon budget is 14 times larger than the budget for the State Department and the Agency for International Development combined. So at a time when we need creative diplomacy more than ever, our diplomatic corps is being starved, and many places don't even have official appointed ambassadors. This same $850 billion is 5 times as much as the annual cost of Biden's Build Back Better plan, which was rejected by Republicans and Joe Manchin because they said it costs too much. So when it's something we need, it costs too much. When it's the Pentagon, cost is no object. Just 1 year's budget for one weapon, the F-35, is comparable to the budget for the Centers for Disease Control. So again, just another way of looking at the imbalance. One aircraft carrier for $13 billion is many billions more than the whole budget of the Environmental Protection Agency. And if we look at the big picture over the years, the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies looked at Pentagon spending over the last 20 years. If we had taken a quarter of that money and put it into clean energy, the entire US electrical grid could proceed without any reliance on fossil fuels. So in terms of climate, just pouring money year after year into the Pentagon is at the cost of what we could do to address climate change and clean up our environment. So it's a huge amount of money, and most of it goes to corporations. Advocates of big Pentagon budgets inevitably say they're doing it for the troops, but they're not. Corporations get more than half the total Pentagon budget. This $37 billion that was added by the House, $25 billion went for weapons, either production or research and development. Almost all of that money goes to contractors. And then out of the $37 billion, $1 billion went to increases in services for military personnel. So a 25-to-1 ratio between throwing money at corporations and doing anything even minor for people in uniform. The top 5 companies alone split $150 billion a year, and Lockheed Martin gets half of that, which is more than the budget for the State Department. So you've got one big weapons contractor getting more money of our tax dollars than everything that's spent on diplomacy. And it's hard to think of a more wrenching example of how displaced our priorities are. And a lot of this increase had to do with special interest politics, pork barrel politics, essentially corruption. So it was introduced by a Democrat, the increase, Jared Golden of Maine, and he threw $2 billion in there for a ship built at General Dynamics Bath Iron Works in the state of Maine. Elaine Luria, the other Democrat who co-sponsored the increase, is from Virginia, and her district borders Newport News Shipbuilding, which makes aircraft carriers and attack submarines. And she made sure there were billions and billions of dollars in that bill for those weapon systems. And it goes on down the line. Money was added for the F-35 combat aircraft, which is built mostly in Texas, Connecticut, and California. And they tried to prevent the Navy from getting rid of some ships that they said were outmoded because they're built in places like Alabama and Wisconsin. So there's this whole money aspect. There's an F-35 caucus in the House that spends all its time trying to get more money for that plane. There's an ICBM coalition in the Senate that tries to keep any changes from happening in the deployment or procurement of intercontinental ballistic missiles, probably the most dangerous item in the nuclear arsenal. So part of the reason that the budget's going up has nothing to do with Ukraine or China or Russia. It's just that there's money to be made, and it's being spread around in one way in campaign contributions, where there's about 14 million a year that goes from the weapons industry to key members of Congress. They've got 700 lobbyists for the arms industry, more than one for every member of Congress. And then there's people from the weapons industry populating government. So, just one stark example is 4 of the last 5 secretaries of defense came from the industry, from General Dynamics, from Raytheon, from Boeing, including the current incumbent, Lloyd Austin, who was on the board of Raytheon before he joined the Biden administration. So there's money to be made, and the contractors are making sure it ends up, in their pockets, their bottom lines. And all the while, most of this money is wasted. Tens of billions in cost overruns on major weapons, many of which don't work as advertised. Price gouging, charging 10, 100, even 1,000% more for spare parts than they should cost on the part of unscrupulous contractors. And of course, the Pentagon can't pass an audit, so they don't even know for sure how much money they're wasting. They employ 500,000 private contractors, over 500,000, and they've got their own lobby, the Professional Services Council, try to make sure they stay, in the government's largesse. So that's sort of one piece of it, the pork barrel politics, the military-industrial complex, which kind of proceeds independently of the state of the world to a large degree. And it's been around since well before Eisenhower coined the term. But then the other piece of it is U.S. strategy, which is still premised on sort of covering the globe militarily, being able to fight almost anywhere on short notice. And of course, in the last few years, with a focus on so-called great power competition, in particular Russia and China. And this focus and a lot of this money that's being promoted predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was under Trump, his national defense strategy called for a focus on Russia and China. And Congress did a commission to look at the Trump strategy called the National Defense Strategy Commission. It ends up more than half of the members of that commission were either from military contractors, consultants to military contractors, from think tanks that got millions of dollars from military contractors. So it wasn't an objective study by any means, but it's constantly used by advocates of more Pentagon spending. And one of the main findings was they should spend 3 to 5% per year increase beyond inflation on the Pentagon in perpetuity, basically. And were they to do that, and they're now on track to potentially do that, the Pentagon budget alone would be over $1 trillion sometime in the next 5 or 6 years. So this kind of number that got thrown out there, the 3 to 5%, really came from the industry and its allies. It wasn't like somebody sat back and said, what's the state of the world? What does the United States need to defend itself? That was sort of window dressing that came later. But of course, the debate, a lot of it does have to do with Russia and China. In the case of China, which the Pentagon calls the pacing threat or the enduring threat, whereas they call Russia the acute threat. The US spends about 3 times what China spends on its military, has 13 times as many nuclear weapons, has a more capable Navy and Air Force, and has allies surrounding China, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, now cultivating India as a possible military ally against China as well. Whereas China has no such allies. They have relations with North Korea, which brings little in terms of supporting any defense efforts they might undertake. So all this talk about China and confronting China is based on a kind of a myth of this huge Chinese military machine that simply doesn't exist. In any case, we shouldn't be spending time, money, and effort planning how to win a war with China, another nuclear armed power. That's absurd and dangerous. What we should think about is how to cooperate with China on issues like pandemics, climate change, improving the global economy. Because if the US and China can't cooperate, we're not going to solve the climate crisis. We're not going to be able to deal with global disease issues and many others. So if we want to survive as a planet and as a people, we have to move away from this confrontation with China and find other ways to relate between the two countries. As for Russia, obviously invasion of Ukraine was outrageous. They're killing civilians. They're committing, no doubt, crimes against humanity. But the idea that the answer to this is to throw as many weapons as possible into the war without having any diplomatic strategy at all about how to end the war, I think is not only foolish, but it could lead to escalation, including possible US-Russia or US-NATO conflict, which could escalate even possibly to the nuclear level. So there's got to be a diplomatic strategy. It can't just be this kind of notion that you're going to throw weapons into Ukraine and quote unquote defeat Putin. And that's been a hard case to make in the mainstream media and in the Congress, but I think it has to be made. And of course, a lot of money is being spent. $53 billion towards aid to Ukraine just this year in a matter of months, about half of it military. More military aid by far than the peak year of support for the Afghan military and police in that 20-year war. And all that money is separate from the $850 billion that I was talking about. It's all on emergency packages that have sailed through the Congress. And the last thing about Ukraine that I'll mention is it's not showing Russia to be this huge global military power. It's showing its weaknesses. It's having a lot of difficulty fighting a much smaller country on its borders. It's in no position to threaten NATO to be a global power. And yet that's the rhetoric we're hearing as a justification for jacking up the Pentagon budget, for building up in Europe, for NATO countries also increasing their military budgets. So all of this is kind of out of line with reality. But I think, what the other side is doing is they've got fear on their side. And here you've got a country that's doing despicable things, and they point to that and they build on that emotion that people have about wanting that to stop. And they use it for other purposes. A lot of the stuff that they're throwing in the Pentagon budget, under no circumstances ever would be used for anything related to Ukraine. But Ukraine is kind of the poster child, the argument that's most convenient at the moment. And if it wasn't Ukraine, they'd use a different argument. They'd use China, they'd use North Korea, they'd use Iran. And they'd find something to throw up there as the threat of the moment that justifies these huge amounts of spending. And then beyond the great power conflict, there's still 800 overseas military bases, US counterterror operations in 85 countries. So there's this whole global military architecture that's over and above whatever is done to confront Russia and China. And it's based on the notion that the United States has to dominate the globe militarily, even though, as we've seen in the last 20 years, all it has been is one disastrous war after another, not only killing and wounding US troops, but affecting hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the war zones. And then in the midst of all this, and again, using Ukraine as a kind of argument, is the nuclear weapons buildup, which was well along. They want to spend $2 trillion over the next 30 years to build new bombers, new intercontinental ballistic missiles, new ballistic missile submarines, new cruise missiles, new warheads, an entire new nuclear arsenal. And the Biden administration wanted to eliminate two small weapon systems out of this huge buildup that had been introduced by Trump. And hawks in Congress are trying to stop them from even doing that, even that small reduction. And they're arguing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a reason to do that, even though the thousands and thousands of weapons that are in the US nuclear arsenal represent overkill and a risk of a nuclear arms race and make nuclear war more likely, not less. So, the other thing I'll say is the Biden administration is moving in the wrong direction in the Middle East. The Middle East situation, President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, where he did that fist bump with the murder and war criminal Mohammed bin Salman, is obviously a step in the wrong direction. Not only does it kind of absolve or legitimize the Saudi intervention in Yemen, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people using US weapons for the most part to do it. But it also, he's creating this sort of anti-Iran coalition, including Israel and the Gulf states, which is only going to increase tensions in the region. And this is at a time when Iraq had sponsored some talks where Saudi Arabia and Iran were trying to lower the temperature, find out some way to have almost a détente rather than fuel conflicts all over the region. And of course, arms sales are continuing to flow into the region, and the US has promised to defend the Saudi regime, and the Saudis are asking the US to keep a large military presence in the Middle East, which the Biden administration had promised to reduce. Meanwhile, what we should be doing, diplomacy, is on life support. The Iran nuclear deal, which Biden promised to revive, is in a very, very difficult straits. But when it was in force, it was preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It was taking war with Iran off the table. And it was at least a possibility of being built on for other diplomacy in the region. And that's the kind of policy that's needed, but we're just on the edge of losing that agreement. So, that's the question becomes, what can be done? And I think, because of the Cold War atmosphere, because of the criticism of people who are raising different ideas about Ukraine or talking about reducing the Pentagon budget, there's a lot of kind of demonizing the critics. I'm familiar with this. It happened to a certain degree after 9/11 as well. If you raise any question about US military policy anywhere in the world, you would get some pushback that somehow you were, sympathizing with terrorists and so forth. So we've been through this kind of thing again. I mean, it has kind of a McCarthyite feel to it, which is, I was a kid then, but I know about it. I read about it. I've talked to people who've been through it. But given all that, how do we proceed? And I think this is where we should, have everybody weigh in to the extent possible. And it's going to be an ongoing conversation, obviously. But one thing, of course, is building across issues. I was talking to Rusty before I gave the talk, and one of the things she pointed out as well, even if you could reduce the Pentagon budget, you wouldn't necessarily be able to spend it to deal with climate change because there's so much opposition to action on climate change in the Congress. So you can't just move money from category A to category B. There's got to be a vibrant climate movement that's putting Congress on notice in order to make that happen. Likewise, we've seen backsliding on racial and economic justice issues, despite the movement for Black Lives, the Poor People's Campaign. But those efforts are going to continue, and we need to build bridges with them, I think, if we're going to have a growing peace movement. The Poor People's Campaign had a march on Washington, and it was not like one of Dr. King's marches from the 60s. It was in the thousands or tens of thousands. But it was very much energizing to their chapters around the country. And they're organized on a state-by-state level, and they're trying to get people to the polls, especially poor and working people who vote in much lower proportions than many other groups in society. And so I think that's a promising undertaking. It's going to have to hang in there for the longer term, because I think it's hard the short term to combat all the different forces that are surrounding us. There's also groups like a group People Over the Pentagon, which is organized with Public Citizen, and they've been trying to get groups beyond the traditional peace movement, environmental groups, immigration groups, and others to join forces to cut the Pentagon budget because there are so many other needs in other parts of society. And they've made some progress. I mean, it's sort of the small glimmer of hope in these terrible votes in Congress is that a majority of the Democrats in the House at least voted against the increase, as did 14 Republicans. I think more importantly, the majority of the country is against these increases, even a small majority of Republicans. And I think if people knew the cost of this spending, both in terms of risking endless war or worse, and also in terms of starving, the government and its ability to meet other needs and other crises, I think that number of people opposing it would increase. But I think also we're going to have to educate for the long term, because I can't say what's going to happen in the next 2-3 months, but I know that we're going to have to really dig in to fight these forces that are kind of consolidating on the wrong side. And there's nothing to be done really but to organize. And so I think in that sense, Brooklyn for Peace is critical, and groups like it around the country, if we're going to turn this thing around. I spent my career since the late Carter administration, writing, thinking about peace issues, disarmament, military-industrial complex. But there's no point doing this if we can't build a movement to change the kind of things that I've been talking about. And that's why I do this. And I do believe we can do it, and I'm stubborn. I'm not giving up, and I don't think any of us should. We should have a conversation, ideally things people are intending to say and be heard by everybody, as opposed to accidental interventions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, so first, Bill, thank you so much for this. Not exactly cheerful talk, but I think a very important one. Now, I'm going to ask the first question, and then we have a bunch of other questions that are coming into the chat. So I want to give you, a chance to respond to them. I was really struck this time about how many Democrats in the end voted for that $850 billion. And, I know when you call their offices, they say they voted for these amendments, they vote for the amendments, they know they're going to fail, but in the end they're voting almost, I think only 38 Democrats voted against it. And I actually looked, I realized that I had a misimpression. I went back and looked at the vote for the NDAA the year before. And even there as well, the Democrats basically collapsed. And I am wondering whether, you think that collapse, how you explain that collapse. Is that because Joe Biden's the president and so you do more or less what the White House wants? Is it because of these lobbies? Is it different now? And again, back to China and Russia. In other words, is that also now providing the framework for members of Congress to basically endorse a hawk approach? I mean, just as a small item, I'm struck with Nancy Pelosi's, idea that she's going to go to Taiwan. Like, why are you doing that? Like, what's that about? How helpful is that? Right. So I guess I'm really asking you, what your thoughts are on the Democrats' collapse on this issue, or you think it's always been this way?
I think it's worse this year than it's been in a while. I think partly Democrats don't want to vote against Biden. I think that's probably part of it because they feel like he's already on thin ice. There's kind of a bureaucratic reason or a kind of a political reason that it often happens, which is sort of as you suggested. They can say, well, I voted for this amendment, this critical amendment, and then they vote for the final bill. And I think they're covering themselves because there's still this fear that they're going to be targeted as soft on defense. So I think that plays a role. And of course, the industry throwing money at them, the plants in their districts, and the notion that they're, they want to show they're tough on China and Russia. So I think they all kind of converge. And so you have some principled members, people like Ro Khanna and others who will stand firm and vote against the final bill. But a lot of them just kind of run for cover. And I think, the vote on stopping that 37 billion was 152 against doing it. But, considering there's 435 members of Congress, that's still not a very strong showing. So we have a long way to go. But I think certainly people should pressure Democrats about why they're doing this kind of thing, because I think a lot of times they, just given the alternative, that they kind of get away with doing this kind of stuff without the kind of pressure that they deserve to have.
Michaela, do you want to take over for the chat?
Sure, thanks. Yes, so we have some great questions coming in the chat, so we'll go to those now. Okay, so sort of a two-parter, and I think you already spoke to this a little bit, Bill, but how do you interpret the statements by Putin seeking to gain a change in the world order, plus their open alliance with China in the light of the increased budget? How do you propose practical diplomacy working when Putin has openly chosen war to alter the international political structure?
Well, I think part of it is a question of power. Putin may want to change the international political structure, but he doesn't have the power to do it. He obviously has the power to cause great suffering in Ukraine, which he's doing in a very vicious fashion as we speak. I think, diplomacy for Ukraine is not an easy matter, but there's got to at least be some feelers put out about how this might come about, as opposed to allowing this to become a long grinding war that goes on for 2, 5, 10 years or more. And things people have talked about are neutrality for Ukraine with security guarantees, how to deal with the territory that, roll back anything Russia's gained in this invasion, and then have a political solution to the other territorial issues. And in the light of this, some promise of reducing some of the sanctions in exchange for Russian participation. I think the questioner is right. Putin is not ready for diplomacy at the moment. I think he's not shown any interest at this particular moment. The only small glimmer of hope was the agreement over grain, if it holds, allowing grain to be exported. So it's a difficult issue, and unlike some other issues that we work on, the U.S. government doesn't have as much power as, for example, we could stop our government arming Saudi Arabia tomorrow and force them to the peace table in Yemen. If we get our government to take a diplomatic approach in Yemen and stop just pouring weapons in without kind of thinking of the longer term consequences, even if the Biden administration had a better position, was more engaged in a diplomatic strategy, that doesn't mean that Putin would immediately jump to attention and say, "Oh yes, I'm ready to negotiate." So it's more a question of getting our government to be as constructive as possible, to not throw fuel on the fire, and then try to work for a better outcome than an endless war, which the people of Ukraine will pay the greatest price for, of course. So it's a difficult problem, but I think our current approach has the danger of making matters worse rather than better.
So in that line of thinking of encouraging the administration to take a different approach, there's a question: do you know if the Biden administration ever invites friendly opposing views to present their positions before they make decisions? And if so, who are those voices? If not, how can one encourage that?
They'll sometimes have meetings with representatives of think tanks. They tend to lean towards mainstream or conservative think tanks. Occasionally, I'll get invited to one of these things, or somebody from a progressive organization, but usually there'll be a dozen or 15 or 20 mainstream think tanks, and then a token couple of critics. And sometimes the discussions are more in the matter of the administration telling us what a great job they're doing and us not getting a lot of input. But they do informally consult, probably a wider range of experts and interests, but they're really, at the moment, I think the hawks have the upper hand in terms of who they're listening to, and in terms of their own key players. Secretary of State Blinken hasn't even talked to the Russian foreign minister since the start of the war. And even if you oppose it, which of course we must, and you would still want to keep some sort of channels of communication open, which hasn't been happening, at least at that level. So, yeah, I think they need to be more open to other points of view. I think the only way to do that is to be public pressure for them to listen to a broader range of views. Members of Congress can weigh in with them, try to open the door for other viewpoints. But it's a difficult moment for doing that, but I think it's worth the effort to keep trying to get at least other ideas in the mix as they're considering policy going forward.
Great, thank you. And so how do you interpret the statements by Putin's, I'm sorry, I already read that one, just gotta scroll down. What if Trump is able to obtain the White House again in 2024? How would that affect the situation you described, since he has openly said he would withdraw from NATO?
Well, Trump on foreign policy is a strange duck. My concern about Trump is if he gets elected, we might not have a democracy left. And so that reason alone is reason to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But on foreign policy, he's a strange mix. He's an isolationist. He's an angry toddler. He's all over the map. So for example, he was going to have talks with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to deal with the nuclear issue. And then when those fell through and didn't accomplish anything, he started making statements about how North Korea would see fire and fury like they'd never seen before. So making, nuclear threats. He has, threatened to leave NATO. But on the other hand, even as he was cozying up to Putin, They were also sending arms to Ukraine. They were also taking a tough stance on some other issues. He didn't accomplish anything on nuclear arms control because he was busy blustering. He did sort of set the stage for getting out of Afghanistan, which Biden followed through on, to his credit. So I think a Trump presidency on foreign policy, well, it would be high risk, I think, because having him in control of the nuclear button, I think, is a nightmare. But in terms of what he might do about troop deployments or how he dealt with allies, or he'd probably cause a lot of damage in terms of U.S. diplomatic relations with other countries. But would he put troops on the ground? Would he have his interventionary policy? Very hard to know. But I think all the other negative consequences of him coming to power sort of, overwhelm anything that might occur in terms of, not intervening in this or that conflict.
Great, thank you. And so another question that I think a lot of folks in the peace movement are asking that's in the chat is, do you support a change in the world security order? And if so, what would that change look like? Would the change include NATO, or should NATO be dismantled?
I think over time, NATO should be dissolved, and there should be a security arrangement that involves all of Europe, that involves Russia. There was a possibility of this at the end of the Cold War, which was a missed opportunity. And this moment today, you're not going to get a lot of traction talking about dismantling NATO. But I think ultimately there's got to be an overarching security arrangement that's more about dialogue and security assurances and arms control and disarmament than it is about massing troops and arms racing and all the things we have now. I think also the United Nations needs to have a stronger role, which probably means reforming the Security Council so that every single important initiative can't be vetoed by one of the great powers. But I think the UN, even in its current state of where it's limited by the great powers, can play an important role as an interlocutor in negotiations. The UN helped bring a truce for the moment to the war in Yemen. They helped negotiate the deal that we're hoping will allow grain to be exported out of Ukraine to the rest of the world. So I think a stronger emphasis and a strengthening and reforming of the UN, more overarching security arrangements that include potential adversaries as well as traditional allies. I think things like the nuclear ban treaty should be pursued vigorously. And then I think we need different economic arrangements because a lot of the conflict in the world has to do with economic deprivation, with corruption of various regimes, as well as other political and cultural factors. So I think if we could sort of build up towards that kind of world, that would be the way to go. I think the going after NATO is a longer term proposition, just because of the moment we're in and the media landscape and the politics that we're faced with. But I think ultimately that should be a goal.
All right, so coming back to advocating on these issues with members of Congress, the actions of politicians, including Nancy Pelosi, seem to be focused on politics / the next election. So how do we get around that to focus on rational / logical / principled foreign policy?
Well, I think we need more people in the discussion. I think that a lot of the leadership takes a very narrow view of who their constituents are. Of course, there's their donors. There's people who vote in high proportions, which tend to be higher income people. There's not as much looking at what about all the people who don't vote? What would it take to bring them into the mix? And that's what people like the Poor People's Campaign are working very hard on to try to change that equation. But even a relatively small number of constituents can sometimes turn around a member. I was at some demonstrations at Elliot Engel's office back when he was still in office, and he was running House Foreign Affairs. And he had been a friend of the Saudi regime and others in the Gulf. But these demonstrations were about stopping arming the Saudis as leverage to end the war in Yemen. And there were only about 10 of us. We talked to his political guy and his press guy, and we recruited some people from his district to go talk to him. There were some Yemeni business owners from the Yemeni diaspora who also weighed in with him. And over a matter of months, he switched sides, voted for resolutions to stop U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia, spoke at the annual meeting of Action Corps, which was one of the leading local organizations lobbying to end the war in Yemen. So it's not always going to be that easy. And he was also looking over his shoulder that he was going to have a primary, and ultimately he was defeated. But I think a combination of, if there's other voices out there, if they feel that there's a political cost to business as usual, we have a better chance of turning them around. But if they think they can just appeal to a small kind of elite base, then I think they get away with a lot more of these things, like the Pelosi proposed trip to Taiwan, which is only going to exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and China, and ultimately it isn't even good for the people of Taiwan.
Okay, so unfortunately, we have more questions in the chat we really have time for, but we'll see how much we can get through in the last couple of minutes here. So I think I'll pick this one that's kind of related to what you were just talking about, and then we'll come back to another. What do you make of the visit to Ukraine by Representatives Barbara Lee and other traditional peace advocates in Congress who declared solidarity with Ukraine in war against Russia?
I think solidarity is one thing, but supporting endless weapons sales and a military solution is another thing. And I think too many members are kind of conflating those two. It's interesting, you don't hear a lot of talk about the millions of refugees from Ukraine. How are they being taken care of? Who's going to put money in? Is the United States going to let significant numbers of refugees in? And if so, will it be part of a more generous policy for refugees from all the other war zones, many of which the US is responsible for? So I think there's a lot of ways to show solidarity without signing on to a military agenda. But I think a lot of members have, they've kind of blurred that line. And I think that's unfortunate.
And so the Ukrainian invasion the invasion of Ukraine has diverted some attention to the Middle East. What should we be prioritizing in Middle East dialogue? Was a question.
Well, I think as late as it is in the day, I think pressing the administration to try to revive the Iran nuclear deal is still well worth it. This administration has barely lifted a finger to move Israel, to roll back the occupation, to roll back the repression, to roll back even assassinations and murders by its security forces. So there's got to be a role for the United States to support Palestinian rights, and not simply sign off on anything the Israeli government at the moment wants to do. And this administration, it hasn't shown any interest in that, but it's got to be revived. I mean, the thing about Biden's trip is he tried to promote it as a peace overture because he thought he could get the Saudis to maybe normalize relations with Israel. But it was also an attempt to build a bloc against Iran, which would increase tensions with Iran, increase the possibilities of war there. And he completely neglected the Palestinian rights issue. So the two biggest possible causes of war in the region were either ignored or exacerbated in the name of this kind of, diplomatic sounding Abraham Accords, which of course were the brainchild of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, not the best known peaceniks on the planet. So I think real pressure on Israel. I think pushing for the Iran nuclear deal. I think reversing course and stopping arming the Saudi regime until they agree to a comprehensive peace agreement in Yemen and stop their internal repression. I think there's many things that could be done, some of which Biden even promised to do and step back on. And I think a reduction of the U.S. military presence, which is still far too large, and it's still at those levels more likely to embroil the U.S. in further conflicts in the Middle East.
Yes, and we at Brooklyn for Peace have certainly been organizing on those issues in the past and continue to do so. So we invite folks to get involved with that. So there are a couple questions about nuclear weapons, and this might be a little ambitious, but we'll try to kind of group them together as maybe our final piece of questions here. So Ukraine is organizing a 1 million person military, and all the NATO powers are committing themselves in various ways to this. There was talk after the February-March fighting of reinforcing Ukraine so it could overthrow Putin. What do you make of such open debates since this conflict has 4 nuclear powers involved? And the other question is there a role in pushing the media, if not to reframe the causes of the war, to call for more coverage about nuclear arms in general, as they play a much smaller role in the public conscious in the last 20 to 30 years?
Okay. So I think, any strategy that talks about trying to defeat Putin militarily raises the risks of a nuclear confrontation. And so I think that shouldn't be anything that governments or others are advocating for. But of course, you hear it much more often than we should. And likewise with the issue of Taiwan, U.S. should not be escalating rhetoric about Taiwan independence. It should stick to the one China policy that it's had for years. But members of Congress are putting forward legislative ideas and statements and travel plans and so forth that are increasing the risk of U.S.-China conflict. And the whole U.S. strategy towards China, the notion that there should be a strategy for defeating China in a war makes absolutely no sense, because a war between 2 nuclear armed powers would be a disaster, perhaps an unprecedented disaster. So in terms of getting the press to cover this more, there was a little bit of coverage when Putin was making the more vocal threats about the possibility of using nuclear weapons, just as there was kind of a moment of coverage when Trump used to make those kinds of threats. But I think somehow we need to break the issue open. And part of it, I think, is what happened with the nuclear ban treaty, which is more focused on the consequences of a nuclear war, the humanitarian consequences, and not just getting in debates about, throw weights and nuclear acronyms and nuclear deterrence. And, once you go down that road of debating nuclear weapons on the terms of the establishment, it's easy to get lost. And also it's easy to lose your ability to educate the public. So I think groups like the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Physicians for Social Responsibility, which has been doing very good work on this, I think have kind of a way in, at least, to trying to change where we're at. And also, I think, other forms of culture. We did a program at Quincy about the anniversary of the day after the film in the 80s about the consequences of a nuclear war, which reached millions and millions of people. Of course, it wouldn't have existed without the nuclear freeze movement, without kind of a major upsurge of public organizing about nuclear weapons created the possibility that a major network would run such a program. But I think, any levers we have, political, cultural, pressing the media directly to do better coverage, I think also supporting independent media like Democracy Now! And Truth Out and others to reach bigger audiences. I think it's kind of we have to work on parallel tracks. We have to push the mainstream media to be better, and we have to get the independent media, help them get bigger audiences.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bill. I think you've given us some really key insights on military spending, why the budget has grown so much in this particular instance, as well as opportunities for addressing this from the grassroots. So we really appreciate you being here and sharing this with us. I think we're kind of ready to wrap up. I don't know if there's anything final that's on your mind that you want to share.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here and thank Brooklyn for Peace for all the great work you're doing. I think what you do is harder than what I do. I mean, being an organizer is tough work. And I think, we're in tough times to do that work, but I'm inspired partly because there's groups like Brooklyn's for Peace that, are willing to take on these issues and educate the public about it. And I think there's a lot more work to be done, but there's a lot of good work happening already. And I don't think we should downplay that. So
thank you. And I think we're in this together.
Yes,
so.
Exactly.
So I think just to kind of highlight a couple of actions that people can take right now or anytime. As Bill explained, we have this excessively bloated National Defense Authorization Act that recently passed the House, and it will be going to the Senate for them to come up with their version of it and vote on it. And so what folks can do now is call their senators and urge them to vote for any amendments to the NDAA that would make top line cuts to the budget and vote against any final NDAA that doesn't make those cuts. So we need to be really pushing hard for cutting those funds and redirecting them towards investing in human needs. And the second key action that folks can take is Representative Jayapal is leading a congressional sign-on letter to President Biden, urging him to support proactive diplomacy in pursuit of a negotiated settlement to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And so this is the first real concrete call for a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine that we've seen from Congress. So we really encourage people to contact your representatives and ask them to sign on to that letter. Please also let us know, get in touch with us if you're interested in working on any of these issues with Brooklyn for Peace further, organizing around reducing military spending or ending the war in Ukraine. And I put our email in the chat so you can get in touch with us directly. And we also invite you to sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with our activities. And I'll put the link for that in the chat as well. And so that concludes our program. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we hope you all have a good evening.